Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first event of the year. We are delighted to be working in partnership with security compliance experts at Adoptech this year. A huge thank you to Al and the team at Adoptech for their wonderful support of our community. And we're returning to a topic which is on everybody's minds at the minute, resilience in fintech, and obviously all of the kind of implications of recent regulatory developments surrounding DORA. So today we will be decoding DORA on our webinar entitled "The Road to Resilience." So it's awesome to be with you today, and thank you for joining us. Just going to start the webinar by welcoming you first of all. And explaining a little bit about the work that we do at FinTech North. Often people in our community have been to many of our events down the years, but some people will be joining for the first time. So for their benefit, I just want to explain a little bit about who we are and what we do. My name is Joe. I'm General Manager of FinTech North. You can reach out to me and the team at info@fintechnorth.uk at the bottom of the screen there if you've got any questions, if you want to get involved with our community in any way. We're always on the lookout for new speakers, sponsors, partners, anything and everything. If you've got any questions about the sector generally in the North, we'd be really happy to answer those. Just a bit of background behind FinTech North as an organisation. We were set up back in 2016 as the first ever regional hub for fintech in the UK outside of London. Really as a response to so much London centricity within the UK fintech economy back then. Any kind of fintech networking, any kind of fundraising activity, all of that was happening within the confines of the M25 in the City of London. Despite the fact that actually in places like Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, we had really deep financial services and tech expertise, and more innovative fintechs were kind of cropping up on the scene. So fast forward to where we are now at FinTech North, and as an organisation, we bring together a community of over 8,000 people, all of whom are interested in fintech, who work in fintech right across the North. We work to support that community and develop the sector in the North, providing profile opportunities to startups and scale-ups, business development opportunities to those organisations as well within our wider network. And all of our activity is done with the objective of promoting the North as a centre of excellence in fintech and writing, what sets us apart and some of the advantages that we do have up here in the North of England. I think this graphic brings us to life a little bit. Events are our kind of primary lever for achieving those objectives. Ultimately, you can't form, meaningful relationships. You can't do business without coming together face to face, and that's primarily what FinTech North's all about. We host events, conferences, webinars like today, seminars, socials, trade missions, you name it, anything and everything, with the objective of promoting the North as a centre of excellence, basically. We couldn't do any of that without the wonderful support of all of our awesome partners, including Adoptech, who are our partners for this year and on today's webinar as well. So I just want to highlight that, as a self-funded organisation, the support of these wonderful organisations really is our lifeblood. So a huge thank you to all of these organisations for their amazing support over the last year or so. Just quickly, if FinTech in the North, for those who aren't aware, I'll just give you a really quick run through of some of the activity that we see. I'll give you a bit of a tour from west to east, and just quickly on these infographics that you can see on screen. These are produced by Whitecap Consulting, one of our parent companies at FinTech North. Whitecap helped to found FinTech North back in 2016. They're a strategy consultancy based in the regions of the UK, and they do some awesome ecosystem analysis of all the regions across the UK. And what you can see on screen now is a really good visualization of the fintech sector in each city. These graphics contain details of all the startups, scale-ups, established fintech and financial services, the tech companies, the investors, the other supporters, so the legal services, accounting services, digital hubs where a lot of these fintechs are based, the investor community, the academic community, and of course the public sector as well. So when we talk about our community, it really is a broad church of all of these people and stakeholders with an interest in the sector. You can find these graphics and these reports on Whitecap's website. They're all publicly available to download, and they're a really great resource for anybody wanting to find out more about who's where in the North in terms of the fintechs. So yeah, without further ado, I'll just give you an idea of some of the activity that we're aware of. So in the UK as a whole, there's probably about 2,500 fintech firms, and in the North we've probably got about 400. In Liverpool, we see a real strength there in wealth tech and insurtech. In Greater Manchester, which is one of the largest ecosystems in the UK outside of London. There's a real strength there in payments and e-commerce. accountancy software also indexes really highly in Manchester. In Leeds, which is where FinTech North started and where I'm sat today, banking, lending, and regtech index really highly. And up in the northeast, there's an innovation corridor between Newcastle and Durham, and payments also comes through really strongly in the northeast as well. I could go into a lot more detail on all of these regions, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of some of the activity that we see across the north. A few more words on FinTech North and kind of where we're going as an organisation and the role that we're playing. I've already mentioned our events as a key way to kind of achieve our objectives. We are having a renewed push on international trade this year. We're keen to support any sort of inbound and outbound international trade activity. Last year, we took a trade delegation to Money 2020 in Amsterdam, which is Europe's largest fintech trade show, and we'll be looking to do the same again this year. So any fintechs on the call, any organisations interested in coming along on that trade mission, please give us a shout if you're interested in the European market. And similarly, we'll probably be doing something similar with Singapore at the end of the year. And there may be other international opportunities that crop up via association with FinTech North. And we'll be working closely with our partners at the Department for Business and Trade on trying to make some trade missions happen in the north of England as well, which will be awesome. On the skills side of things, we've been on a bit of a skills crusade this year at FinTech North. We're really keen to enhance the supply of fintech skills into the sector. And to help us achieve this, we've come up with a new product. We're calling it our FinTech Talent Pipeline Builder. The objective of this product is really to help organizations find the right talent to fuel the growth of their business. So we'd be really keen to speak to anyone in HR, any chief people officers who are looking to kind of sharpen their ability to employ the right people, improve their employer brand, and support fintech recruitment. I'd be really keen to have that conversation with you as well. So if some of this is resonating with you, please do reach out to us at info@fintechnorth.uk. Another thing to mention really quickly before we get stuck into today's amazing content is our season ticket concept, which is a new thing for FinTech North. I'm announcing it today on this webinar. We've been thinking about a way to deliver more value to some of our most loyal members of the community who follow us right across the north. Keep an eye on our channels because we'll be launching this in the next week or so. Basically, a discount across multiple events. You can purchase a season ticket, which is valid for the entire year and covers you for all of our conferences, all of our socials, and provides a bit of a discount as well. It's something you can forward on to your colleagues as well. So it's not just tied to you as an individual. So hopefully that would be of interest to people in the community. We really recognise the loyalty that a lot of people do have towards our events. Final thing to mention on that front is some of what's coming up. So today's the first event of the year, as I mentioned earlier. We've got another webinar next week looking at banking disruption. We've got a social happening in Manchester on the 13th of February and a financial inclusion webinar happening at the end of Feb. We start off in Leeds on the 5th of March, so early March, with another social event. And then our first big event of the year is our Liverpool conference on the 18th of March as well. And you can find details of all of these events on our website as well. I'm sure Rachel and Ryan and the team will be able to post some of the details in the chat as we progress here. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, just about ahead of time, which is good as an event, so we can stick to those times. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our chair for today's panel and our event. Rachel, are you able to join me and take over from me, if that's okay?
Hello. Hi.
Awesome.
Hi,
Glad to have you.
Thanks for that great intro. It was really good to learn more about FinTech North since I'm also quite new. So yeah, everyone, we're going to have a great session today. We've got lots of interesting people talking on this webinar. I'm Rachel Shabilsky. I'm Chief Product Officer at Sigma Financial AI. And I am a Reg SME by background, but actually DORA is probably one of the ones where I've got the most to learn. So I'm personally also very interested to hear today's answers and find out more. So with further ado, we are going to be talking to Alistair Goodwin from Adoptech, and before we go into a more detailed Q&A with the wider panel. So Alistair, would you mind to introduce yourself and give us a quick recap on why we're here and what DORA is all about?
Morning, Rachel. Thanks, Rachel. Yeah. Quick intro for myself. Name's Alistair Goodwin. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Adoptech. My background's in financial services, trading and technology. I worked at a load of big US banks, primarily Goldman's, for a long time. And then for the last 10 years, I've been working in fintech, initially acquiring distressed regtechs, turning around and selling them on, and more recently founding Adoptech. So that's me.
Wonderful. Okay, so DORA. Let's have a little bit of an intro. We know it went live on the 17th of Jan, and there were some delays. What's the latest news on DORA?
So just to give a quick background, there was a previous webinar on DORA, so I won't go into too much detail, just to give people some context on DORA. But just to give you background, why we're here, what is DORA all about? So it's hopefully everybody on the call knows that it stands for the Digital Operational Resilience Act. So it is all about technology risk management. And it's probably worth giving you a bit of background as to why the regulators are really pushing this new legislation. Since 2008 in particular, since the financial crisis, the regulators have been very, very focused on financial risk management and ensuring that a similar crisis to 2008 doesn't happen again. So you'll all be familiar with MiFIDs and MiFID IIs and all the regulations that have come out of the back, which are all focused on financial risk management. In the background, for over 20 years, there have been ongoing discussions with the regulators about technology risk management. And that's really become a lot more apparent recently with the use of FinTech. And all the people on this call are very familiar with FinTech. That creates an additional risk that the regulators are quite concerned about, in particular concentration risk. So they're worried that if there were an incident in technology, that might have a similar ramifications to the financial crisis in 2008. So they are looking at ways of mitigating those risks. Big risk they're worried about is concentration risk. 20 years ago, if a bank had an incident with their technology, it was only likely to impact that bank. Now, if a bank has a problem with technology, there's a good chance that there are many other banks, central counterparties, exchanges, all using the same technology. So it could have that systemic impact. And that's what they're most concerned about. So DORA has been introduced primarily to focus on technology risk management and mitigating those risks. So it's probably worth mentioning that whilst technology risk management should be in place in financial service firms already, the big difference with DORA is just the detail. So it goes into a huge amount of detail. I mean, for some firms, there's 400 or 500 rules that you need to be complying with as a regulated entity. So it's quite an uplift. Now, hopefully, at least in terms of the technical controls, a lot of companies have already got those in place, but there is quite a high requirement to evidence that you're doing all of these things that you should have been doing in the past anyway. So a lot more reporting requirements and being able to evidence you're actually doing the things you needed to do. And then probably the most of the significant thing with DORA is that for the first time, it brings those suppliers into scope. Now, whilst suppliers, so fintechs supplying the regulated firms, are not going to be directly regulated themselves, there's a lot more emphasis on the regulated firms to carry out oversight on their supply chain, particularly if those suppliers are providing technology that underpins a critical, important business function to them. So for the first time, suppliers are really coming into scope with the regulators. As I say, they're not going to be directly regulated, but much greater oversight. What's also slightly different is the regulators have created this new concept of critical third-party providers, CTPPs. So for some particularly large suppliers to the regulated firms that present the greatest risk, they'll be considered as CTPPs, and they will get direct oversight from the new audit body that's been formed by the regulator. So yeah, it's quite a lot of change, and hopefully most of the people on the webinar are already familiar with these things because we had a previous webinar before. If you're not, Rachel and the team will probably share a link to a guide to DORA that gives you a quick introduction. So if you're not familiar with the basics of DORA, please read that guide. Rachel and the FinTech North team will share a link to the guide that you can download.
Thanks. So you mentioned there the regulators, obviously, is there anything like really new? What's the latest from them that the audience should be aware of?
Probably there's a few things that have been going, and probably the biggest ongoing debate has been around the definition of an ICT service. So information communication technology. I mean, it's a strange term that they've used for the start. It's the sort of thing they talked about 25 years ago when I was doing a computer science degree. It's a strange term, but it's a very general definition. Now, the problem with that definition is also people were concerned that if you were, let's say, for example, an asset manager in the US providing a small amount of tech to a European Union financial service firm, that you might be brought into scope for DORA and have to comply with DORA. Now, there's been a Q&A, and the EOPA have provided some guidance actually in the last few days on that, around that definition. So really what they're saying in that Q&A response is that you need to determine whether or not that financial service firm is predominantly a financial service firm or predominantly a technology provider, to determine whether or not you consider them an ICT service supplier. Now, there's some logic you need to go through to determine that, but it's really focused on, are they predominantly financial services or predominantly technology provider? And key, are they already regulated by within the union or by a national authority already? If they're already regulated, so in the example of that US asset manager, then based on that guidance, they're less likely to be considered an ICT service supplier and less likely to be in scope for DORA. Because the worry was that thousands of additional firms that were predominantly financial service firms were going to be brought into scope. Probably the other quick updates. So the RTS, so the Regulatory Technical Standards for affiliate on subcontracting, has still not been finalised. And that's primarily because there's been a lot of kickback from the regulated firms. And actually the RTS was rejected because they're concerned about, there's a requirement at the moment that you need to understand your full supply chain. So if you imagine you've got a supplier who has a supplier who has a supplier, in theory at the moment, if they are supporting a critical or important business function of yours, you will need to include and understand information about that firm and collate it within these certain registers. One in particular, which is difficult to manage, called the Register of Information. Very difficult if you're, let's say, a bank, and you've got a supplier who has a supplier who has a supplier, you have no direct contact with them. It's very difficult to ask them and enforce them to provide you with this information. So it's, in practice, very, very difficult to execute some of the requirements in the subcontracting RTS. So at the moment, that's been rejected, so it's still not been finalised. And then probably one more thing worth mentioning is the adoption of the threat-led penetration testing RTS has also not been finalised as well. So they're not expecting that to be finalised till Q2. That's been pushed back a bit, and it doesn't seem to be a priority for the regulators. And probably the last thing, which is more gossip, but the regulators are making lots and lots of comments about concern around EU financial service firms utilising large US ICT providers. Now, that's probably largely based on the current political climate, but there are comments coming out from a lot of the EU regulators specifically aimed at large US tech firms.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I mean, one of my favourite questions is always usually to work out what's going on more globally and where those regulations are going to hit up against each other and more political positions. So that's very interesting now. Okay, so as you mentioned, different firms are impacted in different ways. How are organisations adapting their approaches to align with the regulation?
You won't be surprised to hear it varies drastically from, for firms that particularly, investment firms that have been familiar with, the MiFID II sort of, and are very familiar with having to deal with regs for a long time, they are not surprisingly further ahead of understanding the regulation and adapting to it. The firms that particularly have been brought into scope under DORA, which is a much wider remit, you've got credit institutions, you've got your CCP, trade repositories, you've got the newbies like the crypto asset service providers that have been brought into scope, right? They aren't familiar with these. Not surprisingly, they're not as up to speed. Now, the regulator's been pretty clear in sort of meetings we've been to with them that what they are expecting in 2025 is that at least you have an understanding of the regulation, you've done a gap analysis, and you have a project underway to address the gaps you've identified. I think one of the challenges is also that the regulators have indicated there'll be no enforcement action in 2025. So to some extent, that's, realistic, because some of the regulation simply isn't clear yet, but it's also difficult for internal staff within institutions trying to get budget and prioritise work when you've been told there's going to be no enforcement action in 2025.
Know that one well. So I guess you've touched on that as a challenge, but are there any other common challenges or misconceptions that you're seeing?
Probably the biggest and most common misconception I hear is around, particularly from suppliers. So fintechs who don't think they're in scope of DORA because they're not considered a critical third-party provider. Two different things, okay? So critical third-party providers will be established by the union and the national competent authorities in the second half of this year. They will get direct oversight from an additional audit body. However, it doesn't matter whether you're a critical third-party provider or not, you are still in scope if you supply technology services to a EU-regulated firm. Now, the extent to which you're in scope is going to differ because there is the concept, it's a risk-managed framework. So if you are providing a service that underpins critical, important function within that financial service firm, there's going to be a lot more oversight on your firm. But just because you're not going to be considered a critical third-party provider with direct oversight from the new audit body doesn't mean you aren't in scope. And that's what I'm hearing a lot from a lot of regulated firms that are saying it coming the same as, but suppliers are just responding to us and saying they're not in scope. Yeah, they are all in scope. It's just a matter, it's a degree of to what extent you are in scope if you're supplying tech.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially for me in my role and what we do. Having a reg SME background, I'm always really keen to make sure that everything we do is like correct and we've got the right governance in place. But with now having moved from a big firm to a fintech, I'm kind of like trying to make sure we understand fully like what we need to do to support our clients, right? If we are somehow going to be caught by it, and we obviously need to do things the right way from the beginning. So this is a really useful information for firms like mine.
So I think it's a good example, Rachel. What the regulator's getting at here is that if a bank chooses to outsource some tech and utilize your services, from the regulator's perspective, they don't care, right? You've made that choice not to do it in-house, you've gone outside, but you still have to have the same level of oversight on your external suppliers as you would if it were an internal function. And they're very, very clear on that point.
Excellent. Right, so on that note, I think we have some other panelists today, and I'm really keen to hear what challenges they're seeing. So I think let's bring them in, and we can get Richard and Dan to introduce themselves, please.
Thanks, Rachel. Good morning, great to virtually meet you all. I'm Richard Curtis, Director here at RSM UK in our Technology and Cyber Risk Assurance team, focusing on cybersecurity and operational resilience. I'm a certified ethical hacker, and I've worked for various leading IT consulting firms during my career, covering a variety of roles in network infrastructure, offensive security, operational resilience, and IT risk assessment. We work with clients in a cyber aspect to improve their operational resilience, and we also provide offensive security solutions such as, which is obviously appropriate to DORA, threat-led penetration testing, red teaming, and cyber incident response exercises. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Richard, and hi everybody. Glad to virtually meet you. But yeah, so I'm Dan Rycroft. I'm one of the directors at Pentest People. So we're a security professional services firm. Much like Richard, we deal with penetration testing, threat-led pen testing, incident response. Previously, I've been a PCI professional, so qualified in obviously PCI DSS, which it's similar-ish standard, obviously with particular focus on cybersecurity. And yeah, just happy to be here and to answer any questions we have about the technical aspects of Article 25 specifically, but also DORA as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. So let's start with you, Richard. What challenges are you seeing in the marketplace?
Thanks, Rachel. I think through the lens of a financial services firm, they've obviously faced several challenges in implementing DORA, all the requirements around DORA. And some of those key challenges include, which is something Al touched on earlier, third-party and supply chain risk management. So DORA obviously mandates stringent oversight of ICT third-party providers, which means that firms must enhance contractual agreements, enhance risk assessments and due diligence. And this obviously takes time to implement and embed. FS firms obviously rely on a handful of cloud service providers, and they need to ensure that the service providers comply with DORA's resilience requirements as well. And for me, a key driver for DORA is the breaking down of silos within firms and the way that structures are formed to bring a more harmonized approach to drive resilience for important business systems across the full sort of operational context of a firm. And then something that Dan will elaborate on further, threat-led penetration testing. So DORA requires financial firms to conduct sort of realistic attack simulations on critical systems. And then many mid-sized firms lack internal red teaming capabilities, and obviously external testing can be costly. And then sort of the other areas, governance and accountability. So boards and executives obviously need to demonstrate clear ownership of ICT risk, which required policy updates and training, again, taking some time to embed and implement.
Wonderful, thank you. So Dan, you're focused on vulnerability scanning and penetration testing then, and whilst most mature firms and fintechs will be conducting these exercises, what's changed with DORA? And for those less technical, can you explain in layman's term what it means?
Yeah, absolutely. So an analogy I like to use is imagine your business as a house. So, take a leap of faith with me on this one. So a vulnerability assessment is mostly automated, and it's done by tooling that's commercially available. And what it does is it's a bit like a house survey. So when you go to buy a house, you will get a survey. Somebody will walk around the outside, they will look at the guttering, they'll look at the doors, and they will tell you what might be a problem. They won't test anything, they won't do anything, but they will just tell you that it's there. There might be a bit of, false positive removal. They might, I guess, kick the tires of something, but they don't really do a lot. But it's part of a wider program. So moving on to penetration testing. So that would be the next step. So you would conduct your vulnerability assessment, and then you would conduct a penetration test. So again, going back to the house analogy, it would be somebody actually trying the doors, trying to break in, trying to get through the windows, seeing where they could get to, and then, in an ideal world, if they got in, getting to your safe. So that might be your domain controllers, for example, so your usernames and passwords. And that obviously is a consultant-led exercise. So the consultant will use tools, but then they will manually go through the data and really kind of poke and prod. And that's the kind of difference between those two. A threat-led penetration test is really the kind of, I guess the end state for what you can do in terms of testing. So that would be, you go to the police, again, going into the house analogy, you go to the police and you would say, right, give me all the crime reports of burglaries in my area on houses around my size. They will give you a report. Again, stretch the imagination here. They'll give you a report to say, well, they usually do this. There's this criminal gang that are doing it this way. You would then employ somebody to then try that on your house. And what you would do as part of a threat-led penetration test is you would observe that happening, and you would see how, A, what you could change, but B, you might also have somebody in the house doing things on the inside to stop people getting in. So you're really testing what really happens. Again, using that report, you're saying, right, this is what's actually happening in the real world to houses like mine, your organization, and you would test your defenses, both, from a kind of wall perspective, but you would also test how your people react, and you would have oversight of that. And effectively, it just gives you a really, really good idea of what people are doing. And in terms of how that is done, so the penetration testing side of things is fully consultant led. So mostly it is also no holds barred. So they can try anything and everything that they can. So that would include things like phishing, actually breaking into your site, again, if you're a business. So seeing if they could walk through the fire door, for example, people leave those open if they go outside for a cigarette, stuff like that. And generally what you would do as part of that is you would look at what are called TTPs. So that is tactics, techniques, and procedures. And again, that could include anything, but it would be very specific to your sector. So fintech, obviously people are looking for things like card details, et cetera, et cetera. How would they go about doing that? There's a whole variety of things that Article 25 in DORA discusses, things like source code review and the real technicalities of it. I guess the thing to take away is what DORA does say is that it's a risk-based approach. So if you're a large company, you might be doing all of these things kind of all together, but where, as a smaller organization, you might say, well, what are our risks? So, you might not have to do a full threat-led penetration test. It may well be that you do something slightly smaller scale, but, and Alistair, I'll kind of, ask you to kind of come in here on discussing with the auditor. So talking to your auditor about what you actually need to do and what is a fully risk-based approach. But Alistair, I'll thank your contribution here.
Yeah, so I think, just on the pen test and vulnerability, it's pretty standard practice that anyone in this sector now should be doing ongoing vulnerability scanning and pen tests. the threat-led penetration testing is only going to be mandated by your national competent authority to typically the larger firms. But I suspect over time that will become more and more the normal practice. But initially, it's going to be mandated by the competent authorities. So you'll be told if you have to do it. And of course, if let's say Bank A is carrying out threat-led penetration tests, they've got 50 suppliers who are all providing services that support that critical or important function that they're testing. They're all going to have to need to be involved as well. So if you're a supplier, you may well get called into some of these activities as well. Challenge for suppliers are that they could be supporting 50 banks who are all doing testing. So there is this concept of sort of pooling some of these threat-led penetration tests, but we'll wait and see how well that works out. It'll be interesting to see how that actually, how people actually do that in practice is going to be quite difficult to coordinate. And in terms of what the auditors expect, one of the challenges with DORA is it's quite explicit in things, as you say, like Article 25 about things like source code scanning. And it talks about the idea of things being risk weighted and the potentially smaller firms. But actually, they've even got the concept of what they call the simplified risk management regime. But you actually go into the detail of that, it's got pretty much everything the main regime's got it. Because the regulators, when they were creating the technical standards, had to follow the legislation, and the legislation basically didn't give them a huge amount of bandwidth to reduce what those smaller companies need to do. They bang on about the concept of proportionality, but the problem is if it says in the legislation that you need to do source code scanning, then you need to do source code scanning. Now, to be fair, you could take the concept of proportionality and say, we're only going to do it in this particular space and not over everything. But I think that is one of the challenges because they've been so specific, unlike other regs where it's more sort of principle based. They've been really explicit in the things you need to do. So from an audit perspective, I'm going to go in and look at a company and do a gap analysis of what they've done. I'm going to expect these things to be done or a very good reason, and it's going to have to be very well documented as to why it hasn't been done. So if the regulator knocks on the door, they can say, we didn't do it because we used the concept of proportionality, and here's our justification, and it was approved by the senior management team and the board. So that's, it's a challenging one.
Oh, interesting. And I think maybe what you've touched on, there's another acronym here that we haven't talked about called TIBER. So we talked about the threat-led penetration testing, but can you elaborate on TIBER and the UK equivalent frameworks for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So TIBER is an EU framework. So it is the framework for threat intelligence based ethical red teaming. So red teaming is effectively the penetration testing, but it's called red team because it's red team, blue team. I'll go into detail about that in shortly. But so the UK version is CBEST or C Star. So these are both run by an organization called CREST, which is the de facto standard for penetration testing in the UK. So CBEST was a collaboration between CREST and the Bank of England. And effectively, again, what that is a threat-led penetration test. It's just a slightly different name, as with a lot of laws within the UK, a lot of it is taken from, so similar to GDPR, we have the UK GDPR. It is the EU version. We've just taken that and turned it into something else. And C Star is just a different version of that, really. They're the same thing. They're still run by Crest, except one's the Bank of England and one is the same thing, but just isn't done with the Bank of England. So effectively, what that framework is a comprehensive guidance on how authorities can procure and run these threat-led penetration testing exercises. So what it effectively states is that the red team and the blue team, so your in-house teams, should work collaboratively together to run these assessments to get the most benefit out of the back of them. Because as with all these assessments, the actual exercise itself is only as useful as what you do with the information that comes out of the back of it. So where in TIBER, what they do is they would actually send a team from TIBER itself to oversee the exercise. Within the UK with CBEST, it's done between the entity and the organization doing the testing. It's just slightly different. So I guess, again, you would probably talk to your auditor on exactly how they want you to run that. Do they want you to run it through TIBER, or do they want you to use the CBEST framework? Again, it depends on your auditor. Both are the same. Both are as equally valuable. They're just slightly different in terms of who does the overseeing. But as I say, in terms of I guess what comes out of the back of it is the most important thing is that post-event activity. So if you look at things like the NIST cycle for wider security with IR, so it's preparation, detection, analysis, containment, eradication, and recovery. and then that post-event activity. And that's really, really important. So if you do one of these exercises, what the auditor will want to see is A, it was conducted in the correct manner, but B, what you've actually done with the results and how you have improved. As with all of these things, it's about continuous improvement. They know that nobody is perfect, but again, it's about resilience. It's about building resilience in the framework so that if something was to go wrong, you have at least put steps in place to make you resilient. And that, again, is just the most important thing.
Okay, great. We've got a question from someone. I wonder if maybe we could just take that. We'll see which of our panelists wants to do that. It says, I am an appointed representative for a network. Does the liability purely sit with the principal firm? Maybe, Al, this is back to you.
Thanks, Rachel, for that one. I'm not entirely sure what you mean by representative for a network. In terms
I
of...
can jump in there if you'd like, Al.
Yeah, please do. I need to elaborate on what you mean by a network, if that would help, unless you get it. Richard, go for it.
So under DORA, the principal firm holds primary liability for compliance, oversight, and ICT risk management. However, I think as an appointed representative, you may have contractual obligations, and any non-compliance could impact your role within the network.
Okay, great. Okay, so while we're with you, Richard, was there anything else in particular you wanted to touch on, or we can maybe, I think we've got some poll questions that we could ask our audience if we want to do that.
Yeah, I think obviously as the UK already had an established operational resilience framework governed by the Bank of England, the PRA and the FCA, many of the things from DORA just extend on from that. So it's just delving into a deeper level in all of the areas. And then, as Dan mentioned, focusing on that threat-led penetration testing when that requirement comes into effect. I wonder if there'll ever be a physical element to things. We often do sort of physical tests where you can get into a client's environment and access data. Anybody carrying a clipboard and a ladder, they will just let you through the door. So interesting to see how it will evolve over the time.
Wonderful. Okay. Fine. Let's see. We've got some poll questions here. How is your organisation approaching the challenge of aligning DORA with other regulations like NIS2, GDPR, and EBA guidelines? And there's another one there, which is, what is your organisation's biggest challenge with implementing threat-led penetration testing under DORA? We'll give people a bit to answer those.
So whilst Rachel were just touching on the sort of the other regulations, that first question aligned with DORA, it's probably worth just touching on the fact that from a supplier's perspective, they've been very familiar with having to align themselves with technology risk management frameworks like ISO 27001, NIS2, SOC 2. As a fintech these days, you're going to struggle to sell your services into any regulated firm unless you can demonstrate compliance with some of these certifications. So the suppliers are very familiar with this type of process, albeit DORA goes much, much further. I think the key difference here with DORA is that whilst the regulated firms have had guidelines, the EBA guidelines and things like that, DORA really does go a lot further, as I was talking about before. So and I don't think, from what I've seen in the marketplace, that people have fully understood quite how much is involved with DORA, say the sort of 400-ish rules that most companies are going to have to be complying with. Not just complying with, because they might already be doing some of these things, it's being able to evidence that they are complying with it. And one thing we didn't mention in this so far is that there are really significant fines associated with non-compliance, much like GDPR. Firms that are non-compliant can be fined 1% of their global revenues per day for up to 6 months. So if you're, a large US fintech that everyone seems to be focusing on, you can imagine the kind of global revenues that they've got. And 1% of that is a large number. That over 6 months means that there are actually quite large ramifications for non-compliance with the legislation.
Rachel, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Joe or Rachel, do you know where the answers to the poll comes in, do we need to?
Yeah, we can pop them on screen now for you.
I think there were actually a couple more questions as well. Let's see what people have said. Well, okay, 55%. We are in early stages. We recognise the overlaps, but still assessing how to streamline compliance. Well, that's probably a very good answer. Having worked in regulation for many years, I think that's quite an important point here. Is that it gets to the point where we have so many regulations and so many things do overlap that if you're a firm that's subject to most of them, it can be quite complicated and difficult to work out where to spend your time and your money. Number 2. Okay, so we had what's your organization's biggest challenge, and 60% went with cost and resource constraint, which is kind of what you'd imagine. And that's interesting. So, lacking internal expertise, but I guess that's why people like our panelists are here to offer their services and help with the very technical things that I certainly wouldn't know where to start with. So that was number 2. Did we get some answers to number 3? So how is your organisation managing concentration risk with critical third-party ICT providers? And 50% monitoring and risk assessments. We're increasing due diligence and real-time monitoring of third-party providers. So that's a good answer.
Sorry, before we jump into the next, I think that's interesting as well. Monitoring and performing risk assessments. These are all timely exercises requiring advanced tooling. So a lot to implement in a short space of time.
Indeed. Last question we had was, how prepared is your organisation for DORA? Well, that's fairly kind of split across the answers here, with the first 2 being fully prepared and partially prepared. So that's pretty good to see. Is that what we would have expected, panelists?
I think fully prepared is a bit more out of my expectations. I would have assumed most would be partially prepared, especially because the guidance hasn't really been, fully defined and implemented yet. And as we've all said throughout this webinar, there's a lot to do in a short space of time. A lot requiring board approval for funding for extra utilities, tools, and things, and the way that they work with clients. So to see that a third is fully prepared is interesting.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think I'd be quite surprised to see that many fully prepared, particularly when you've got some real complexities with some of the data you need to be collating on, as we mentioned earlier, the supply chain side of things. The registers of information that you need to collate is really quite complex. You need to have every vendor, every contract you have with that vendor, every service you have linked to each of those contracts, and you need to be able to demonstrate you've done appropriate due diligence. So over each one of those services under each one of those contracts. And that could be at multiple levels through your supply chain. I'm more familiar with some of the sort of, exchanges that we work with who are quite close to collating that information, but it's been a huge undertaking. And those are companies that are very familiar with this type of thing. So I'm very surprised that there's kind of a third of people are that far forward with so much complexity.
Of those people that replied, I guess we have some very keen and forward-thinking firms on the webinar, but there might well be some more who have joined who are maybe didn't answer, but who are definitely more aligned to what you just said, Al. Okay, so where do we want to take it from here? Does anybody in the audience have any more questions?
I think we have another question. How does DORA cover the ESG principles?
You want to take that one, Richard, or Al?
Yeah, sure, can do. I think DORA sort of aligns with ESG principles mainly through governance by enforcing strong ICT risk management, resilience, and accountability. It supports social aspects by ensuring probably financial stability and consumer protection. And then on the environmental side, its impact is indirect. So enhanced cybersecurity will contribute to reducing risk associated with digital infrastructure sustainability.
Yeah, I think it's very strong on the governance piece. Right the way through the legislation, it constantly talks about, the necessity for the board approval, senior management approval, good communication throughout the organisation, particularly when it comes to risk awareness, who's approving the risk, um, incident management in particular as well, when it comes to sort of understanding and communicating incident management, which we haven't touched on much actually. It's probably worth mentioning that DORA does change from the EBA guidelines in terms of incident reporting. What the regulators are generally trying to do is get to the point where, where there is an incident within the supply chain impacting regulated firms, that they get notified as quickly as possible so they can determine whether there is a systemic risk. In fact, there's one of the things that recently came out of the European supervisory authorities was the results of a feasibility study they've been carrying out on trying to collate information in a more efficient manner when it comes to incidents so that they can respond more effectively. And one of the points in DORA, which most people ignore because it's not mandatory at the moment, is this whole concept of sharing, threat intelligence and incident information. It's not been mandated, and therefore people don't often touch on it. It's the chapter 5 when people talk about the chapters of DORA, but actually because it's not been mandated, people generally aren't focusing on it. But I suspect in some way, shape or form, the regulators are going to start insisting over the next few years that if there are incidents or there's threat intelligence that you're aware of as a regulated entity, that you will need to pass that to your national competent authorities and ultimately up to the sort of European level. The challenge obviously is if you do have a threat or you're undergoing some kind of incident, you've got to be pretty sensitive about who gets receipt of that information, because there's not just obviously the impact to your business, but there's a potentially huge commercial impact to your business if others were aware that there was some kind of incident going on, or you had been made aware of something that others weren't. So, the governance piece, they are very, very strong on.
And I just wanted to touch on further from something that Al mentioned around the incident reporting. So another requirement is firms must report sort of significant ICT-related incidents to regulators using standardized templates. And incidents need to be reported within hours rather than days, which obviously creates operational and technical challenges, not only in reporting, but in detection, classification, and escalation as well.
Yeah, 4 hours for a major incident from the moment they go aware of it. So a real challenge. There's some more questions coming there, Rachel.
Yeah, I see that. So it says we haven't heard from regulators yet. Are they taking a pragmatic approach to regulation or baselining compliance before actual enforcement?
Yes. So I think I touched on this earlier. This for example, the Central Bank of Ireland, just before Christmas, made a comment that they wouldn't be carrying out enforcement actions in 2025. So what their expectations are that you have done a gap analysis, you've got a project, and if the regulators come and knock on your door, you can demonstrate that even whilst you might not be fully compliant yet, that you will be soon, and you've got a very clear roadmap to full compliance. So yes, they are taking a pragmatic approach. I think they had no choice because a lot of the guidance still hadn't been finalised, and there's a huge amount of complexity in some of the things they're asking firms to do.
And from my previous experience, I would say though, just having a plan with some dates on it, but not having started any of it might not be the way to go. So yes, have a plan, but do actually look like you started some of it, I would say. And then going back to what we spoke about earlier, is DORA going to affect both the UK and EU or just the UK? Let's talk about the bit of the politics and the global aspect here, Al.
So absolutely affects the UK because most UK financial service firms also have a presence in the EU, particularly following Brexit. Unless you are solely in the UK and you're not providing any technology services to EU regulated financial firms, then you'll be in scope. So scope is EU regulated financial firms and their suppliers. Now, as I say, most UK firms also have the EU presence, so it's going to impact most.
Yeah, and I know a lot of fintech firms as well on the other side have clients all over the world. Mine, for one, we actually do a lot of work with US businesses because AI is super popular over there. So it's interesting to me, like kind of how this is going to play out in the long term more globally.
Yeah, probably the easiest way to think is a bit like GDPR. If you are in any way impacting an EU citizen's personal data, then you're in scope of GDPR. It's the same way of thinking about DORA. If you are in any way providing services to an EU regulated financial service firm, then you're going to be in some scope.
Okay, great. And we have another question. How PCI DSS certification helps with DORA processes? I don't know what that is, so if somebody clever than me would like to answer.
I can pick that one up. They definitely do intertwine, so that there are a lot, well, I'll say a lot of overlaps. As with most of these, they are about risk management, and obviously access control, encrypting data, incident response, and obviously just generally security testing, vulnerability assessments. There are some very specific requirements in PCI because they are specifically looking at cardholder data. It's not just your overall business. All they care about is 16-digit PAN. That's really all they mind about, or the 3-digit code on the back of your card. So yes, it will help. Some of the evidence will be applicable to the auditors in DORA, but obviously it's how you present that evidence will be slightly different. So one thing, I guess, again, is to really talk to the auditors, when it comes to it, about DORA, and to talk to them about what evidence you can use and what can be used. So say, for example, source code, so requirement 6 point, can't remember which it was off the top of my head. So web applications taking cardholder data, a lot of that is around protecting the source code, and then scanning it for vulnerabilities and stuff like that. So again, Article 25 in DORA talks about that, but it's, obviously with auditors, you have to be very specific. So I guess in straight answer to the question, yes, it will help. And it may help with some of the processes, again, around auditing and third-party risk management, et cetera, but it's making sure that you've got it in the right way, and presenting it in the right way. Al, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, we map all of the underlying sort of controls across all the frameworks, including PCI DSS. So most firms will probably see that 50-60% of the DORA controls, particularly technology controls, are already going to be complied with through your PCI DSS compliance. The thing is, whilst that's a percentage of controls, in terms of effort, what I'm trying to communicate here is that there's a huge amount of reporting effort that's specific to DORA. So even if you've got 1,001 technology controls in place, you're secure as it can be, you've got great operational resilience, there's still a huge amount of work to do purely on the management of the framework and reporting around the framework and being able to demonstrate with evidence that you're doing all these things. That's where it's a big uplift for DORA that I don't think people have quite appreciated, because they're like, oh, we're already secure. We do this, we have pen tests, we're doing all these things, but just, I think they've completely underestimated the sort of the management overhead, the operational overhead of managing DORA.
Thanks. I think we just had another question come in. So how deep into the supply chain do companies need to go for DORA compliance, third party, fourth party, fifth party, etc., etc.? I think you touched on this earlier, didn't you, Al?
So I'll take it. Yeah. So as it stands, if the supply or supply chain underpin a critical, important business function that you should have defined already, then you need the whole chain as it stands. But this is the bit that's causing a lot of debate with the union, and this is the reason why the RTS was rejected. So that's the theory. In practice, nigh on impossible to get some of this information. Your supplier is not going to even know who you are. I mean, we help some fintechs and they're getting questions from their regulated customers, so they're sort of asking for the contact details right the way through their supply chain, like names and email addresses of people. They have no right to give up some of this information as it stands. So in practice, doing this is extremely difficult. So that's why it's been held up. So I'm afraid we don't have an explicit answer yet. It's one of the RTS that's still been debated, and it's the priority in terms of the sort of the outstanding information from the regulators. So I suspect that we will hear within the next month.
Yeah, great. And I saw there was another question that we didn't fully, well, we may well have answered it, I think, in answering the others. What's the opinion of the panel in terms of regulator expectations for Jan 26? What progress will they expect firms to be able to evidence? So I think we've probably touched on that, over the next 12 months. Al mentioned like making sure you have a plan, that you know when you're going to do certain things. Obviously, we're a bit beholden to the regulators agreeing certain requirements, so it's a bit up in the air from that perspective. But Al, if there's anything else you want
to... not surprisingly, just before Christmas, the regulators issued a notification sort of highlighting the fact that it does go live on January 17th, 2025, and there is an expectation that people are compliant with the legislation. Just reinforcing the fact it is legislation. This isn't guidance. It's gone live. It's going live, or has now gone live, to try and, I guess, reinforce the importance of delivery. In reality, I think we all know when fines start to occur, which will no doubt happen at some point early 2026, or if there are any major incidents, that's when people will really start to wake up to these things, I think. But hopefully, my advice would be don't wait till then. The regulator needs to see you implementing a plan this year. Ideally, you'd have done it last year, or at least a large majority of it. But yeah, don't leave it any longer.
Great, thank you. Joe, do you want to take over from here?
Yeah, happy to jump in. We're approaching time. I think it's been a tour de force of DORA today. It's been an awesome discussion. I want to thank everybody for sharing their insights and expertise. So thanks to Rachel as well for doing an awesome job chairing the discussion today. And as always, thank you to the community for all of your questions and your engagement. Ryan's put a link to Adoptech's awesome guide to DORA in the chat as well. So I would encourage everybody to download that and check out Adoptech's website. And indeed also, do a bit of follow up with our speakers as well, connect with them on LinkedIn. And I just want to thank them all for sharing their morning with us. And I'll probably bring things to a close now. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And we'll be looking forward to welcoming you to another FinTech North event soon. So yeah, thank you everybody.